We've examined the anthropic principle evidences of the rather large, from the Earth to the solar system to the galaxy to the universe. Now we're going to reverse direction and go down to the very small and look at the anthropic principle characteristics of that world. The size of the atom or smaller. First, those particles that are smaller than an atom, those things we call the subatomic particles or below atomic particles. These include a number of particles, dozens of them, scores of them. The ones that are most commonly understood or known are the electrons, protons, and neutrons. And if we look at the electrons and protons, these are interesting particles. These two particles, an electron and a proton, carry a particular amount of electric charge. They each carry exactly the same electric charge, except opposite. The electron has a negative electric charge and the proton has a positive electric charge. You might think that two particles that carry exactly the same charge might be similar in other ways, like being of similar size. But alas, that isn't true. The electron is actually much smaller than the proton. The proton is 1,836 times the mass of the tiny little electron. So this much tinier particle has the same mass as this huge particle. And that ratio of masses with the same charge turns out to be another of the characteristics of the universe that's essential for life. Because the protons are so large, and the neutrons are about the same size, they tend to gather together in the nucleus of atoms, or are held together in the nucleus of atoms. And that permits these tiny little electrons to spin around very fast. They're attracted to the positive charge of the protons, and they can run around this nucleus, producing this object we call an atom, with a nucleus with closely packed protons and neutrons, and this very diffuse cloud of electrons moving very rapidly around them. This allows for the creation not just of these atoms, but these electrons are free enough to be shared from one atom to another and hold atoms together to produce molecules. It is because of this ratio of mass, 1,800 times the mass of an electron being the mass of a proton, that allows for the generation of molecules necessary for life. And if we're looking at definitions, if you have a nucleus with a certain number of protons, and around it you have the same number of electrons, and the electrons are attracted to the nucleus if there aren't enough electrons there. If there are 4 electrons around the nucleus, but there's 5 protons in the nucleus inside of it, then there's a charge of 1 that attracts another electron. So electrons tend to gather around the nuclei in the same number that the neutrons are found in the nucleus. When you have the same number of electrons around the nucleus as you have protons in the nucleus, there's no electrical charge for the whole object, and the whole object is called an atom. When you have an unequal number of protons and electrons, then the whole object has a charge. So let's say you have 1 extra electron going around the nucleus, then you have protons in the middle. The whole thing's going to have a charge of -1. If you have 1 less electron than you have protons around the nucleus, it's going to have a charge of +1. Either way, if the whole object has a +1 charge or a -1 charge or -2 or -3, if it has any charge at all, it is not called an atom, it is called an ion. So an ion is a nucleus and electrons around it where there's an unequal number of electrons and neutrons. Not only are there very special subatomic particles in the universe that make life possible, but there's very particular elements in the universe that make life possible. Elements with very special properties. what are elements and what does this mean? How do we determine that? We're going to turn to a concept called the periodic table. It was observed a number of years back that the characteristics of a particular atom depend on the number of protons that are found in the center of the atom. Irregardless of how many electrons are spinning around the outside, the particular characteristics of an atom are determined by the number of protons. So the number of protons, which is also called the atomic number of an atom or an ion, determins its properties. And an element is an element includes all of the atoms and ions that have the same atomic number. In other words, all the atoms and all the ions that have the same number of protons in their nucleus. That would be an element. Back in 1869, a scientist by the name of Dmitri Mendeleev observed that if he lines up the elements that he knew about at the time in order of mass, heavier elements being set aside in one direction, lighter elements in another, as he weighed them in a sense, he found that the properties of the elements changed as he went from mass 1 to mass 2 to 3, 4. As he increased mass, they steadily changed their properties. And then every 8th element, the element changed back to or had the same properties as the first element. So the 9th element in a series had the same properties as the first. And the 10th element had the same properties as the second. Very curious. There was a periodic change or a repeat of characteristics in such a way that if he arranged the atoms in a different way than just line them all up, if he put them in a table of columns and rows, where he put the atoms of the same characteristics in vertical columns, he ended up with what is called the periodic table. And here we have it displayed here on the bottom with all the elements that were known, many more than were known at the time of Mendeleev. He didn't have very many of the elements. He sort of postulated that the whole table was full of elements, even though he didn't know them. A very interesting prediction made by him. If we examine the very top of what's called the periodic table, periodic because, again, every 8th element in a period, repeats the characteristics of the element 8 sizes smaller than it is. If we just look at the first 18 at the top of the periodic table, and this number up here above the element is its atomic number, that is to say, it's the number of protons in the nucleus of the atom. We have an atom here with only 1 proton. Way over here we have an atom with 2 protons. Then we have an atom with 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 and 9, 10. Start over again on the third row. We have 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18. Remember, an element includes all the atoms and ions with a particular atomic number. Like 2 would be the atomic number of helium. Helium is an element with particular characteristics that are shared by all atoms and ions of helium. As we examine these first 18 elements of the periodic table, and we won't go to the others, these are the simple ones, but you get into chemistry a little bit more, you can spend more time figuring out the rest of the table. The properties of the respective elements seem to be due to how many electrons are filling the orbits around the nucleus. To explain what's going on here, I'm going to use an analogy, which I hope helps. It's kind of a strange analogy or a strange situation, but bear with me and hopefully you can follow the analogy, understand it, and then apply it to these atoms. Let's say you have a theater and you're the owner of the theater, and so you develop certain rules about how people are to be seated as they come into the theater. Let's say you do not sell tickets ahead of time online. You only sell tickets at the door. So as the patrons come in, the first patron is put in one of two seats in the front closest to the stage. The first ones get the best seats in the house. But according to the way you design the theater, there are only two seats in the very front row. In the second row, you have 8 seats. They're behind or further away from the stage, so they're not quite as good as the seats in front, but there are only 8. The third row has another 8 seats. Subsequent rows have other numbers, larger numbers, but we're only going to look at the first 3 rows. The rules that you set up in your theater are: the first person that comes in must sit in one of the 2 seats in the front row. They cannot sit anywhere else. The second person who comes in will sit in the other one of the 2 seats, thus filling the front row. They cannot sit anywhere else. Those are the rules. The third person that comes in must sit somewhere in the second row, but they can sit anywhere among the 8 seats of the second row. The second person, third, fourth, fifth, all the way through the 10th person must sit in the second row. If 10 people come in, you fill the first row and fill the second row. Nobody's allowed in the third. The 11th person will sit in the third row and all the way through the 18th person. So these can be seen as seats around a stage, let's say. 2 seats in the front row, 8 seats in the second row, 8 more seats in the third row away from the stage. A further rule that makes this a really weird theater, that is, you really don't like to have empty seats in a row where one person is sitting. If you have one person sitting in one row, he's all alone, either one of the 2 seats but not both seats filled, you don't like that situation. So you're going to look for people. You might even grab people from the street and stick them in that second seat. Or you kick the person out of the one seat and don't have anybody in the row. You'd really not like any situation where a row isn't full. So you're really striving to get situations where you have full seats. Under these circumstances, the possibilities are, if you've got 2 people coming into the theater, you've filled the front row, you're very happy. If one other person comes in, you really don't want to give them a seat at all. You'd rather they don't sit in that second row at all. It's not until you get the 10th person in that you're really happy and want to shut down the theater and start the production, when you've filled that second or third row. And around an atom is similar. There's seating around the atom. The first orbital, the first row, if you wish, for the electrons can hold 2 electrons. And the second orbital, the second row of seats for electrons, can hold 8 more. The third orbital can hold 8 more than that. And all of these elements can be understood to be the theater in various degrees of being filled. A hydrogen a molecule, a hydrogen element, an atom of hydrogen, has 1 proton, doesn't have the second one. So he's sitting there with an open seat, which is not the best of all possible situations. Helium, however, with 2 protons and 2 electrons, has filled this first row. And a helium atom is very happy. The lithium atom, or ion, has 3 protons, and if it's an atom, it's got 3 electrons. It's got a single lone electron in the second row. The beryllium has 2 electrons in the second row. Boron has 3 electrons in the second row. Carbon has 4 in the second row. Nitrogen has 5 in the second row. 8 has 6, 9 has 7, and 10 has all 8 filled. We call these columns group 1 is one where the outermost row of seats has only 1 electron. So group 1 atoms like hydrogen, lithium, and sodium have a single electron in the outermost set of seats. Group 2 have 2 electrons in the outermost row. Group 3 have 3 in the outermost row. Group 4, 4. Group 5 have 5. Group 6 have 6. Group 7 have 7. And Group 8 have the 8 seats of the second or third row completely full. Now, once we've got that set up, if we've got a hydrogen atom is sitting there all alone with 1 electron in the outer, the innermost row, if he encounters another hydrogen atom, which has also got a single electron in that first row, they don't like having just 1 electron, but if they get together and share their respective electrons so that the 2 electrons go around both of the nuclei, then each nucleus seems to have 2 electrons in that outermost row, and it's, we'll say, happy. It's filled its row, and when those 2 electrons are shared, it holds those 2 hydrogen atoms together, and they function as they create something called a molecule. They automatically get together to produce a molecule. In the case of helium, it's got 2 electrons filling its first shell. He's perfectly happy. He doesn't want to share with any other electron. He doesn't want to give away an electron. He doesn't want to take an electron. He is perfectly happy to play his own games and not have anything to do with any other atom that exists in the universe. He is what we call a noble gas. He's got his nose in the air. I don't want to have anything to do with anyone else. I am not going to play games with you guys. I'm not going to interact with you. I'm not going to share electrons. I don't need any electrons. I have my outer shell completely full. Neon has 10 electrons. It's got its first and second shell completely full. It doesn't need to play any games. So it is also a noble gas. Argon is also a noble gas. And it's a gas because it doesn't want to get together with other electrons and form heavy molecules. It stays apart and floats around in the atmosphere. These are all gases that won't engage in any other molecules, won't engage in chemical reactions. They are the noble gases. That's group 8 elements in the 8th column. In the case of group 1 atoms, like hydrogen, lithium, and sodium, they have 1 electron in their outermost shell. If they encounter a group 7 atom, one that has 7 electrons in their outer shell, you've got an atom here who would kind of like to either get rid of an atom, of an electron, or gain 7. And you've got another atom that would like to either get rid of 7 electrons or gain 1. You know, if one of these group 7s gets together with a group 1, they could share, like a hydrogen get together with a fluorine. The electron around the hydrogen could be shared with the 7 electrons around the fluorine to satisfy both the hydrogen and the fluorine with full electrons, full group of electrons in their outer shell. So in fact, group 1 atoms would love to get together with group 7 atoms and share electrons, thus filling their outer shells. So we can produce, for example, we can put together sodium and chlorine, sodium contributing an electron, chlorine accepting it. And what you get is a combination of sodium chloride, NaCl, which is in fact the chemical formula for table salt. Table salt loves to get together. If you put sodium and calcium together, they complete their outer shells. Let's say that you have an oxygen atom. It's a group 6 atom, which means it could use 2 more electrons to fill its outer shell. So let's say an oxygen comes in contact with a hydrogen. It could in fact borrow an electron from a hydrogen, and it would have 7 in its outer shell. Well, why don't we add another hydrogen? If we add a second hydrogen, there would be 2 electrons shared around the oxygen. So oxygen would go from having 6 to 8 in its outer shell, and it would be very happy. Its outer shell would be complete. That would be 1 atom of oxygen and 2 atoms of hydrogen, which is H2O. You combine 2 hydrogens and an oxygen. They love to get together to produce something we call water. Let's see, what's another possibility here? We could produce, well, let's go down through here for some examples. What sort of things, how many hydrogen atoms would like to combine with each other? We've just talked about that. 2 of them would like to get together to finish their outer shells. And H2 is the formula for hydrogen gas. When hydrogen is seen as a gas, it's in this H2 form because they like to share their electrons. We've already looked at how many sodium and chlorine would like to get together. 1 sodium with 1 chlorine finishes the outer shell. Sodium chloride is the formula for salt. How many hydrogen and oxygen would like to get together? 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen to produce water. How many carbons would like to get together with oxygens? A little more challenging. Carbon here is group 4. It could use either to add 4 more electrons or to give up 4 electrons. And oxygen would like to gain 2. So if oxygen was to be, if 2 oxygens were around, they would need a total of 4. Oxygen or carbon could give up 4. You could give up 1 carbon and 2 oxygen would fill the outer shells of a carbon and 2 oxygen, producing carbon dioxide. In this process, you can now things get a little more complicated with some of the atoms, but you're starting to see how it is or why it is that particular atoms combine with other atoms in the ratios that they do. It has to do with the way God created atoms and orbitals and the rules He laid out for how to fill those orbitals. And it's really cool. If you get into this, it's what chemistry is. It's how it is that these various atoms get together in the ratios that they do. And for our purposes here, I'm going to focus on one particular atom, the carbon atom, because carbon is sitting there with 4 electrons in the outer shell. It could either give up 4 or it could accept 4. It's sort of like having 4 arms. It could connect with 4 hydrogens, for example, and fill its outer shell so that you would have CH4. Well, CH4 is methane. It's a popular gas. In fact, methane gas is natural gas. Carbon has the potential of reaching out in 4 different directions to grab onto other atoms. Nitrogen could use 3. It can reach out in 3 directions. Oxygen needs 2. It could reach out in as many as 2 directions. Fluorine can really only reach out in 1 direction at most. If we back up to boron, it can reach out in as many as 3 directions because it could get rid of up to 3 electrons. Beryllium 2 directions, lithium 1 direction. This reminds me of back when I was a kid, I was playing with Tinker toys. I know that dates me, I'm really aged. But Tinker toys are these things that kids play with that involve sticks and little connectors that the sticks stick into. And if you stick the connectors and sticks together, I mean, you can create all sorts of things. You can create robots, you can create cars, you can create, it's just your imagination is really the limitation to you. But when you have a connector that only has one hole, that's not a connector at all, because you can only stick a stick into it and fill that hole, and then you can't do anything with it. That's the end. If you have a connector with two holes, then you can stick one stick in on one side, one stick in on another, and you can connect two things. The most desirable connector is one that had lots of holes. The more holes it has, the more sticks you can put into it, the more interesting things you can develop from it. Well, of all the atoms that we see in the first two rows, carbon is the one that has the most holes in it, if you wish, the most hands. It can reach out and connect with the most other atoms. It can reach out in 4 directions. In either side, boron and nitrogen can only reach out in 3 directions. Oxygen and beryllium can only reach out in at most 2 directions. Fluorine and lithium can only reach out in 1 direction. And of course, these noble gases, they won't have anything to do with anybody, so they're not useful to anything. The carbon is the one that has the most potential. You could put carbons together with carbons, you could put carbons into circles, you could put carbons into 3-dimensional structures, you could create any shape you want with carbons because they can reach out in so many different directions. And that makes carbon the most important element. If you want to make complex molecules with all sorts of turns and shapes and all of that sort of thing, you build it out of carbons. A carbon as the centerpiece of such molecules allows you to create any number of different molecules. And in life, organisms need complex molecules. They have to be built from something like carbon. Now, they could be built from something like silicon, which has the same number of possibilities. But silicon is a little bit bigger. It's the strength of its sort of its hands, its arms, its holds, it isn't as great as the strength of carbon. So it doesn't produce molecules that are as strong as molecules produced on the basis of carbon. Carbon is the perfect atom, the perfect element to build the complexity of molecules that you find in life. So it turns out that carbon is a very special element that happens to be absolutely necessary for life. If we didn't have an element like carbon, we wouldn't be able to produce the molecules that organisms are built from. But it turns out it's not just carbon that's important for life. We don't have time to get into it, but there's reasons why hydrogen is absolutely essential for life. Oxygen has its own properties that make it absolutely essential for life, as is nitrogen, sulfur, sodium, and calcium. These are all elements that are in those first few rows of the table. They turn out each to have very special properties. That if we didn't have elements with those properties, life would not be possible on this planet. So we can look at characteristics of the world of the very small, subatomic particles, and even the elements, and see that it seems to be that this universe has properties of even these very small things that have to be what they are, or life is not possible at all. We're next going to look at properties of compounds, of molecules that are built from these, and show, lo and behold, there are anthropic principal characteristics for molecules as well. If there weren't very special molecules in this universe, life would not be possible at all.